Hey guys, welcome back to 247 DIY. Today what I've got for you is a how-to video on how to remove your fuel tank from an 02 or an 03 WRX. Now this is going to be specific to those two year models. However, Subaru likes to keep things very similar throughout their year models. So you can probably go ahead and apply this to year models beyond 02 and 03, but it may start to get more and more different depending on how new your WRX is. So this video is going to be filmed just a little bit different from how you would normally do a how-to video. Obviously, normally you would start at the beginning, but when my WRX here started leaking fuel, I just wanted to get to the bottom very quickly of what was going on. So I went ahead and I ripped everything apart and we got the fuel tank out as quickly as we could just to figure out exactly where our leak was. But what we're going to do is a very detailed reinstallation. And so what you should be able to do is just watch the video through and then just do all of these processes in reverse to get your fuel tank out of your WRX. And I will point out that we did do a repair to this fuel tank due to a small pinhole leak from rust. If you're interested in checking that out and you need to repair your tank, that'll be linked below. You can see the products that I used and the process and how I use them to repair this tank. Now what I wanted to do was I wanted to pour some of this fuel out because there is probably about 8 gallons of fuel still in there. It'd be a lot easier if I get that fuel out to get this tank back up there. It's not going to be impossible, it just would have been nice, but unfortunately due to all the safety features, you can't actually pour the fuel out through the fuel neck. You could try to like unbolt the top or the fuel pump, but then it's going to go everywhere and make a mess. So I think I'm just going to try to get it in there with the fuel that's already in the tank. So first let's go ahead and talk about how I went ahead and got the fuel tank out. A lot of people, when they explain how to do this, they do it what I believe to be a lot harder than it needs to be. What they suggest is you take the drive shaft out, you remove the axles, you take the lateral links out, you get your rear differential down, and then you can take this whole subframe out as one piece. But that's a whole lot of extra effort. It doesn't really need to be done. As you can see, I lowered the entire rear end down in order to have enough room to slide the fuel tank out. And all that entails is undoing your brake calipers, undoing the strut from the knuckle, undoing the end links from the sway bar because that's going to stay in place, as well as some extra little odds and ends that I'll explain as we put this back together. But this makes it a lot less disassembly in order to get that rear end drop down and enough room to get the fuel tank out. So as you're reinstalling the tank here into this area, obviously the less fuel it's going to be in your fuel tank, the lighter it's going to be, the easier it's going to be. I'm going to struggle a little bit because I still have a decent amount of fuel left in the tank. I just couldn't really find a great way to get it out without going and buying more things or spending a lot of time on it. It shouldn't be so heavy I can't handle it, but we're going to get this back up in there. Now, the way that I'm going to put this back in is going to be similar to the way that I took it out. I'm basically just going to place the tank in my lap while I'm seated on a creeper, and I'm going to work my way up in there, and we're just going to slide the tank there in between the subframe and the body of the car. And if you're curious, when this tank came out, I had just enough room to squeak the tank out. So if you're doing this at home and you need to know how high to get the vehicle, from the bottom of the vehicle to the lowest point of the bump here for the spare tire, we're about 26.5 inches. So you want at least 26.5 inches from the ground to this little bump here on the bottom of the spare wheel well depression. More might be a little easier. Like I said, I had just enough room to get it out of there. I could lower the rear end a little bit more by taking some wood out of there, but I didn't want to strain the components of the rear end here too much. So let's go ahead and get this tank back up in there. So before we get too carried away, moving stuff up here, while we still have access and clearance here to the bottom of the fuel tank, what we need to do is reconnect some of our connectors. So you have this harness here that was already taken off. This bleed plug here goes into your fuel pump connector, and then you have these lines here. Now, I don't know if this was from when I installed my fuel pump or not, but they actually route underneath of these hoses for your fuel pump. So I had pulled these off. I just put them back on so that I didn't forget where they went. We're just going to pop these off, run these cables underneath, and we'll route the rest over this way. So you've got this black plug here that plugs in right in front of this metal plate. And then you've got this long plug here that simply clips in to these little black clips here on this harness holder. One right there, another one right there, and then that just plugs in right over here on your sending unit that transfers fuel from this side of the tank over to this side of the tank. So now we can go ahead and work on getting this tank up into place. Alright guys, so the tank is mostly up there. I didn't film it because it's just a giant pain in the ass. I used a couple of 2x4s to get it started. You can kind of stick a 2x4 up in here and wedge it up, as well as I placed another piece underneath with a floor jack coming in from the front of the car to get it up there. And I've got this bolt just started, so it's hanging there, but we need to come over here and address some of these, or at least one of these lines before we get everything underway. So you have this line here coming down, that routes up over to your evap canister. Sorry, out of frame there. This line here, and if your tank's all the way up there, you're not going to get that on there. I don't know if I can get you up in here, but it's going to be, you can see the tip of my index finger, this evap line right here from the top of the tank. This just needs to get on there. And then with that one on there, we have this smaller line here that's just going to go to this port right here by my index finger. We'll get that on before we get the tank up the rest of the way. Alright guys, so once again I didn't film it just because it is very frustrating. It's just one of those, if there's a will, there's a way type situations. Utilize my jack and some other methods to get it up in there so that we could get these straps hooked on. Now the bolts aren't done all the way up because we just have two more lines I want to connect before we go ahead and tighten these bolts down and get it all the way up in there. You've got a breather line here. Well, I'll get that when I'm not holding the camera here, but you got a breather line here that's just going to connect to that hard line, and then we need to just reconnect our fuel filler neck back up here. Alright guys, so fuel filler neck is now attached as well as this line, and I did go ahead and tighten up these two strap bolts here. Now when you're doing that, just kind of listen to it as it goes up, just in case you've pinched something, but if you've put everything back where it came from, you shouldn't pinch anything as that goes up in there. The last thing we need to do is route this evap line back over to your charcoal canister. It does detach over here on the tank, but in order to do that, as this tank's coming down, there's a metal cover on top, and you're almost guaranteed to snap those bolts off, or I should say those nuts that are on those studs off to that metal cover, because without taking that metal cover off, you're not going to get to the clamp that holds that on. So if you want to avoid breaking those studs off, this line just kind of routes up here, and it's going to route up in there next to this line down here to your charcoal canister. There is this little T right here, so you just got to find that line. He's up in here with a little clamp, and you're just going to put these lines on there. I disconnected this one. It wasn't necessary. I was trying to find how exactly I was going to do this originally, but yeah, you're just going to reroute this big line here all the way back over to this port on your charcoal canister. I did clip the factory zips that hold it up because it actually routes right along. It's paired with this hose here as well as your electrical connection that comes over here to your charcoal canister. So I'll just throw some new zip ties on there once this is up underneath there. And then lastly, over here on the driver's side of the tank, a little hard to see here because I'm working with some bad lighting. You just have 3 lines that come off the tank. You've got one hard line here that's just a spring clamp connection here. You've got another soft line that goes up to a hard line there that's just you've got this soft line here that goes to a hard line over here. And then you've got another connector just like your fuel pump connection on top of the tank, and that's just going to clip into place. Alright guys, so with that, the hard part is out of the way. We have the fuel tank up there, we've got our filler net connected, our fuel lines connected, our evap emission system lines connected. What I like to do now before we get too ahead of ourselves and get the mechanical portion of this back up, we're just going to put the key in the ignition, turn it to the on position, off again, on again, maybe 3 or 4 times just to build fuel pressure and make sure we don't have any leaks. Alright, so obviously if your tank's completely empty, you're going to have to add some fuel in order to build fuel pressure. I had just enough in the tank where it was able to build some pressure. It was a little gurgly because it was drawing some air, but you could hear it drew actual pressure on the system. There's no leaks, I don't smell any fuel, so we're good to move on. So now we're just going to get our jack here and we're going to get underneath the rear diff and get this whole subframe unit back up. And then there's just these 4 17mm bolts that secure that subframe to the underside of the car. Now in order to make sure that we didn't pull too hard on the parking brake cables or these ABS sensor cables, first we disconnected the ABS sensor cables up in the cabin, so we can tuck these up in now and reconnect them. We'll do the exact same thing on the other side. And you can see here we disconnected the parking brake cables. They go right here with your ABS sensor bracket right in front, and that's just on the rear of this trailing arm. That's a 12mm bolt that's just going to go right in there and secure those up out of the way, and it's the same on the other side. Alright, so next what we need to do is we have to secure these arms here. There's like a T-brace here that runs across the back of your rear diff housing here, runs straight across, and there's a bracket here, 17mm bolt that runs through to your body, as well as 2 12mm bolts that holds that bracket on. And that's what that'll look like once that's up in there, and we'll do the exact same thing on the other side. Now we can go ahead and throw our bolts back through our struts, get them reattached to the knuckle here on the rear end. I don't know if they changed it in later models, but unlike the fronts, there is no dedicated camber bolt here in the rear. So when these come off, don't worry about needing to know exactly the position of those bolts, because you can't adjust camber with the stock hardware that comes on this model year. And then lastly, we can go ahead and mount our calipers back up. Just be sure to come in with some brake clean on a rag and clean up your rotor here, because inevitably you end up handling it a lot while you're doing this, and you just want to remove a lot of the contaminants that you smeared onto that brake rotor. And we'll do that again on the other side. And then lastly, you want to go ahead and get our sway bar connected back up. On this side, I ended up taking the whole thing off because I removed this side first, but this bolt didn't want to come out of the bushing here. It's kind of rusted in, so I ended up taking the lower one off. And then lastly, we can go ahead and reinstall our catback portion of the exhaust. I'm not going to film this because honestly, if you got to this point and you're ambitious enough to get your fuel tank out, uninstalling and reinstalling the catback portion of the exhaust should be a piece of cake. And once that exhaust is back on, we can throw our wheels back on and get this down off jack stands. And there, now it's down on the ground. We still have to put the rear seats, the interior, back together. But one thing I like to do at this point is just start the vehicle and let it run. We can kind of stick our head in the back, smell or listen or look for any fuel. We've already built fuel pressure, so it should be fine. But it's just one more thing before you get too ahead of yourself to just try to identify a leak if there is one. But I am absolutely filthy right now, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to shower, change, come back out, and we'll finish this up. And I'm back. So let's go ahead and fire this up and just make sure it doesn't seem like we have any leaks or anything negative going on with the car. All right, so everything seems normal. There's no leaks or anything like that. It did throw a code right at first. It was P0183, fuel temperature sensor A circuit, high voltage or something to that effect. All I did was I used my access port to reset the codes on the computer and then started it back up, and there's no code right now, so I'll keep an eye on that. I believe that sensor is in the fuel pump assembly, so if that comes back, I may have to pull the fuel pump assembly and just make sure all the connections are tight there. But for now, it looks like that code's off, and we can go ahead and get the interior back together. So first, we have to throw these access covers back on. They're pretty simple. They just have this foam piece that goes underneath and the cap that goes on top with some Phillips head screws. One for the fuel pump over here and one for the sending unit that sends fuel back over to the side of the tank. We'll get those on and I'll be right back with you. All right, so now we need to get these trim pieces back on here. They go right here. You're gonna have 2 bolts up top, 2 bolts on the bottom, a push pin that goes right here, and now we can go ahead and get our seat back in. And so when the seat back goes in, you kind of got to lift it up and then bring it down because it catches on 3 hooks, 2 on either side and 1 in the middle. Once you have those hooked properly, you just have a 12mm here, 2 12mm here, and another 12mm over on the other side. And in order to get that seat bottom in, you just start with the back of it down first because it'll index into a little metal hook here in the center. Once that's in, you bring it down, and there's just 2 12mm bolts, 1 on either side, that you tighten up. And so that's really all there is to it, guys. Saying that, I realize that might be oversimplifying the process a little bit. It can be a relatively tedious and time-consuming process to get the fuel tank dropped out of one of these cars. But I wanted to make this video and post this just to show you that there is a little bit of an easier way than typically what you're going to find people recommending you do. Doing it this way, you don't have to worry about disconnecting your lateral links, which would involve an alignment once you're all done with it. You don't have to drop the drive shaft. You don't have to pull down the rear diff. There's a whole lot of disassembly that you can avoid by doing it this way. Again, I do apologize that it's filmed in reverse order. I understand it'd be a lot easier to follow it if I had started from the beginning, but when I found the fuel leak in this, I just wanted to get the tank down as quickly as I possibly could to really figure out where the fuel was coming from. And so that's why I filmed in reverse order, showing you guys how it goes back together. But if you watch this video in its entirety, kind of get an idea of what's going on, then you should be able to watch it from the end and kind of go back to the beginning. You'll see everything involved with how to drop the tank, and then get it back up. And it's not a process that anybody wants to do, but sometimes you're left with no choice, such as a small hole in your fuel tank that you need to get patched. So with all that said, I hope you enjoyed the video and I hope you found it useful. If you did, please hit that like button. Feel free to leave a comment below. And as always, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Thanks.